It was taken in the autumn of 1907 in a small town in rural Ohio. A funeral, a modest gathering of mourners dressed in black, standing in careful rows around a wooden casket positioned at the center of the frame. At first glance, it looks like hundreds of other funeral photographs from that era. Mourning portraits were common practice, a way of honoring the dead and preserving a final record of who had gathered to grieve. But look closer. Standing directly behind the casket, partially obscured by the shadow of a nearby tree, is a figure, tall, still, positioned exactly where no living person should have been standing. Because that space, according to the funeral home's own seating arrangement, preserved in a ledger that still exists today, was deliberately left empty. When a photo archivist specializing in early 20th century mourning photography examined this image under digital magnification, he found something that made him stop scrolling entirely. Because the figure behind that casket was not blocked by shadow by accident, it was standing in a position no human being occupied that day. And every person present at that funeral, according to the names recorded in the church register, has been accounted for. This is the story of who or what was standing behind the casket of Edmund Hale in October 1907. Before we continue, if stories like this find something in you, if you've ever looked at an old photograph a little too long, subscribe and leave a like. It costs nothing and it tells us to keep looking. Marcus Webb had spent 11 years cataloging funeral photography from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His work was unglamorous by most standards. He worked out of a small archive room attached to a historical society in Columbus, Ohio, surrounded by boxes of donated family photographs nobody else wanted to sort through. But Marcus had a particular fascination with mourning photographs specifically. The strange, formal rituals families once built around death. The way grief in that era was something you composed for the camera. The photograph arrived in a donation box from an estate sale, unlabeled except for a single name written in pencil on the back. Hale, 1907. Marcus laid it flat on his desk under his lamp. A cabinet card, slightly warped at the corners, the image itself remarkably preserved. A funeral procession arranged in the front yard of a modest farmhouse, a wooden casket on a raised platform at the center. Around it, perhaps 14 mourners, dressed in black, arranged in 2 careful rows. A minister stood at the head of the casket, hands folded. The family, a widow and 3 children, sat closest, their faces composed in the rigid stillness the era demanded. Behind the casket, a tall hedge and a single bare tree marked the edge of the yard. Marcus had catalogued hundreds of these. He almost set it aside. Then he noticed the shadow. It fell at an angle inconsistent with the tree behind it. Too vertical, too defined, with an edge that suggested something solid was casting it rather than branches. He reached for his magnifying glass. There, partially folded into the darkness beneath the bare tree, directly behind the casket, was a shape, tall, upright, roughly the height and proportion of a standing adult, but with none of the detail, no visible clothing, no face, just a column of darkness denser than the shadow around it, standing in a gap between 2 mourners that Marcus, on first glance, had assumed was simply empty space. He scanned the photograph at high resolution and pulled it onto his monitor. When he increased the contrast and isolated the shadow beneath the tree, the shape held its form. It wasn't a trick of compression or a flaw in the photographic plate. It had edges. It had a consistent density from top to bottom. And critically, when Marcus mapped the direction of every other shadow in the photograph? The mourners, the casket, the tree itself, they all fell in the same direction, cast by a single afternoon sun positioned to the upper left. The figure behind the casket cast no shadow of its own. It simply was one. Marcus called a colleague he had worked with twice before, Dr. Helen Ashworth, a historian specializing in funeral records and county archives across rural Ohio. "I need you to look at a seating arrangement," he told her. A funeral from 1907, Hale family, somewhere near Licking County. It took Helen 4 days to locate what Marcus needed: a surviving ledger from the funeral home that had handled the arrangements, the Briggs and Sons Funeral Parlor, whose records had been donated to the County Historical Archive decades earlier. Funeral homes of that era frequently documented exact arrangements: who stood where, who served as pallbearers, who delivered remarks. It was considered a mark of professionalism. The ledger entry for October 1907 listed the Hale funeral in careful handwriting. 14 mourners, their names, their positions numbered 1 through 14, sketched in a small diagram beside the entry. Helen cross-referenced the diagram against the photograph. 13 positions matched exactly. Position number 9, directly behind the casket, beneath the bare tree, was marked in the ledger with a single word: vacant. The arrangement was for 14 mourners, Helen told Marcus over the phone, but only 13 people are named. Position 9 was left empty deliberately. The minister's notes mention it specifically. They reserved that space and asked that no one stand there. Why would they do that? Marcus asked. Because of who was supposed to be buried there, Helen said. Edmund Hale wasn't the only person who died that week. What Helen found next came from a source she hadn't expected to need: a brief notice in the Licking County Gazette dated 3 days before the funeral. Edmund Hale's younger brother, Joseph, had drowned in a mill pond on the family property 8 days earlier. His body had never been recovered. The family had held a small private service for him, separate from Edmund's funeral. But local custom at the time, documented in Helen's research on Appalachian and rural Midwestern mourning traditions, held that a space should be left open at a family funeral for a relative whose body could not be properly laid to rest, a practice meant to acknowledge the unburied dead, to give them a place among the living one final time. The Hale family had left position 9 vacant for Joseph. He had drowned 8 days before this photograph was taken. His body was never found, and in the one surviving photograph of his brother's funeral, the space the family had deliberately reserved for him is not empty at all. Marcus sat with the photograph for a long time after that conversation. He thought about the precision of it. 14 positions accounted for in a careful ledger. 13 named mourners standing exactly where they were assigned, and 1 space left open on purpose, occupied by something the camera recorded and no living eye that day apparently saw. He thought about Joseph Hale, somewhere beneath the surface of a mill pond that had never given him back, and a family who built an empty space into their grief specifically so that he might still belong somewhere. A photograph does not know what it has captured. It does not decide what deserves to be remembered and what does not. The shutter opens, the light enters, and whatever occupies that fraction of a second is fixed permanently, whether anyone intended it or not. Edmund Hale was buried that October afternoon, surrounded by 13 people who loved him, and 1 space they left open for a brother they could not bring home. Whether that space remained empty is no longer something this photograph allows us to be certain of. If you've ever attended a funeral and felt, for just a moment, that the room held one more person than you could account for, you may understand now why that feeling exists. Subscribe. New video Wednesday. What we found near the water where Joseph Hale disappeared is the next photograph we need to show you.